So I'm sorry to interrupt your interesting conversations. We are going to start our last uh, panel. It will be followed by the closing remarks of John Lloyd. And I'm here with Donald McIntyre and Alison Mutler. They were already introduced to you today, yesterday, and we are going to talk about whether journalism is doing its job. And of course, I hope that the panelists will be able probably first to answer the question, maybe, what is journalism? If we talk about journalism job, we first need to understand maybe what's journalism. And I would quote from our new Bible, our new European Bible, which is the European Media Freedom Act, that was adopted by the bureaucrats in Brussels. And we have maybe at the same time high hopes in regards to this legislation, but at the same time, of course, we are very skeptical. And in this European document, in the preamble of the document, journalism is defined as being a pillar of democracy. And also, this document talks about media services as being the outcome of journalism, and is defining what media services should be and should not be. And in terms of the journalism job, the European Media Freedom Act is talking about the fact that journalism should empower citizens to make informed decisions, including about the state of their democracies, and about the fact that quality media services are an antidote against disinformation and foreign information manipulation and interference. So, of course, these are very complicated words. Let's see in the real journalist's life how they see what's the journalism doing and whether it's doing it right currently.
This question of is journalism doing its job, I was very tempted just to say some is, some isn't, and then hand over to Alison. But I guess I have a responsibility to do a little more than that. And let me just say that in thanking the Ratu family for convening, and John to convening this incredibly interesting forum, it's a little bit more, I say that not just ritually, because one of the things that's really impressed me about the some journalists who are doing their job is that practically everyone in this room, certainly from Romania, Moldova, in at least one case Ukraine, clearly are doing very determinedly doing their job, often against, as we've learnt in the last 24 hours, tremendous odds of interference, pressure, political, economic. And I must say that's been very inspiring to people like me. There's a danger in Western Europe, I think, and probably in the US as well, of becoming a little complacent and feeling we have all the answers. Actually, I've learned a tremendous amount from what I've heard from you guys, and I'll maybe come back to that later. Because one of the things that I've become aware of, perhaps more intensely than I was before, is that while you're on the front line of these problems, we also have in common some of those, perhaps lurking less dramatically in the background. The most obvious is the prevalence of social media and the damage that's done to the clout and pull of what we all hate calling the legacy media. And that's a very big problem for us as well. And it's not just going to be solved, although I think it can help, by doing our job better in the so-called mainstream media, because there are, as Polita was saying yesterday, as Pavel was saying this morning, there is a very big need for some serious regulation. One of the things which I was fascinated to hear a bit more about was, dealing with what I call the anonymity problem of social media. But that's not really I'm happy to talk about it in questions, but that's not really what I'm here to. So I just want to refer a little bit to a few of the problems, most of which we do have in common, though in slightly different form. The first, funnily enough, because I think it's very basic to the whole picture, is the tremendous decline in local journalism, which is a big phenomenon now in Britain. And I admit I'm biased. I spent nearly 5 years working on a local paper before I became a national newspaper journalist. I learned practically everything about journalism I did on local papers, but that's not really the point. The point is that this is very bad for local democracy. What's happened is that not only have the local newspapers in Britain and I suspect in other Western European countries as well, died, contracted, become mere mouthpieces for one interest or another, but the majority are now owned by large national conglomerates whose main interest is in making profits. And so even those local newspapers which have survived have seen their staffs very, very severely reduced. Private Eye, the satirical magazine that's obviously read by a pretty small minority of the population, has taken to producing a page of local news about corruption in local authorities around the country. And in many cases, if you live in many places, that's probably your only source of information about what's going on in your council. And obviously it's very small indeed. One of the things that's happening, though I suspect, and I think this is familiar to you, I was talking to our colleague from Constanza earlier, is that you are getting internet operations started with a real interest in trying to cover local news, local corruption, and the rest of it. But there are certainly in my country not nearly enough of them, and there need to be more, which brings me, I suppose, to my second point, that we in the so-called legacy media need to recognize that not all of the job of information in the 21st century, this decade of the 21st century, is going to be done by the mainstream, so-called mainstream broadcasters and press. A lot of it is going to be done in web-only form, and that's happening. Actually, in Britain, it's happening in quite a big way, and there are some good and very professional web-only organizations. They tend, just a little bit of a bugbear of mine, to be more skewed towards the political right than the left. That's not so in the US, where I think there's a greater political spread of web-only news gathering and information providing. I just mentioned a Brit, actually, Mehdi Hasan, has had a big success so far with a newish agency called Zetio, which is beginning to make some political waves more from the left than the right. But it's what he calls accountability journalism. And I think it's actually quite an important development. And obviously, I'm a little bit proud that in this great American media jungle, a Brit is doing it. So I think that's something we have to be quite humble about, that, it's not all going to be solved by the New York Times or the FT or the Guardian or the BBC, important as they all are. One thing I also wanted to mention, which is something that I think will be familiar to some of you here from our conversations that we've been having last night, is I was about to say a crisis. I think that's the wrong word, but a problem in political journalism in Britain. This is a bit more controversial, and some of my British colleagues may disagree with this. I'm reminded of a famous line from a satirical verse line from Humbert Wolff. You cannot bribe or twist the British journalist, but seeing what the fellow will do unbribed, there's no need to. Now, I'm not, I don't want to exaggerate that, but I speak as somebody who was not only a political journalist, but also actually at one time chairman of the Political Journalists Association in London. So some of this is self-critical, if you like. I think there's always a danger for political journalists and specialist journalists of other kind to become a little too close to their sources, to let their sources, and of course in the case of political journalists it is invariably politicians, set the agenda a little bit more than they should. And I think what you see is a sort of plethora of stories saying the government is about to do this, or the opposition is about to do this, and that gets in the way sometimes of actually finding out what's going on. And I, again, can talk about this later, but Sam Friedman, British writer, has written a tremendous book called Failed State, in which he talks precisely about the failings of the so-called political lobby. Now, let me be clear, there are some really brilliant political journalists in Britain, and I'm sorry to be so parochial, but it's important, just as I'm absolutely certain there are in Romania. But that is still, I think, a problem. By the way, it's not just a problem for political journalists. If I can just digress for a moment, I remember once when I was in Israel as a correspondent being asked by the sports desk of The Independent to go to a press conference being given by Jose Mourinho, and I was asked to ask Mourinho about a slightly ugly incident he'd been involved in where he had threatened the referee halfway through a game, I think against Barcelona from memory. And I remember asking this question, and every single football correspondent in the room turned round to me like I was some kind of leper. And then the press officer said, "I'm sorry, we don't discuss things like that here." So, I mean, I've just mentioned that as just an example about how lobbies in Western journalism can build up. I also think that we have a problem in the British context, particularly, and again, I'm sorry to be parochial, of an increasing polarization politically and an increasing lack of pluralism. The Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail, and I'm afraid to some extent the Times, have now become increasingly everything the Labour government does is wrong. I mean, I'm of course exaggerating to make a point. The notable exceptions, I think, to this lack of pluralism are, in fact, and I'm not just saying to flatter John and Polita, I think the FT is a notable exception, and in America, the New York Times, which has, columns from the right and columns from the left. I don't exempt the left of centre from this, where I think the Guardian has also fallen a bit into the trap of, as we say in Britain, preaching to the choir. They used to have a lot of columnar material from people who didn't share the Guardian's values, Tories, so on. And I think it's regrettable. And of course, I absolutely don't want to get into the trans debate, but Suzanne Moore, who was a brilliant columnist on The Guardian, left not because she was sacked, but because she felt uncomfortable as a critical feminist being in that paper. So I as I say, I'm not exempting the Guardian for that problem. And if we're talking about plurality and impartiality, we also have a problem, I think, of even the modest amount of regulation that does exist. And I think there are lessons here for all of us. Alan Rusbridger, the former editor of The Guardian, as it happens, has just published onslaught, if you like, on GB News, which is a newish broadcasting organization, which is flouting every accepted convention and actually regulation on impartiality in broadcasters, a regulation that the BBC, Sky News, Channel 4, ITV have all pretty rigorously kept to over the years, and is very close in its outlook to the far-right nationalist Nigel Farage, who, by the way, has a show on the programme. And one of the things that Alan has done, I think, probably successfully, is to show that Ofcom, which is the regulatory body, has really not done its work in steering them back to a more impartial form of broadcasting. And I think that worries me less. I mean, I am worried about GB News, but I think what it also illustrates is that Ofcom is really not up to the job that it needs to do in terms of dealing when it comes to social media and it comes to dealing with the platforms. I mean, of course, this is not just a national problem, it's an international problem, but there are things which national regulators can do, and I just don't think ours is up to the job at the moment. So let's just return very briefly, and then do shut me up, Liana, if I'm droning on too much. I mean, I'd just say, when it comes to individual journalists, we've touched on this, and Alec touched on it this morning, I do think that truth is important. And I'm reminded James Cameron is probably not a name that will be widely known here other than as the film director of the Titanic, but James Cameron was a British journalist in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And he said in an interview with Studs Terkel, "I may not have been satisfactorily balanced," he said in his life, which was a sort of Cameronian understatement. And then he said, "I've always tended to argue that objectivity was less important than the truth." And I think that is more or less where I stand in journalism, but with one huge caveat, which is that doesn't absolve you remotely, and of course it does absolve much of what appears on social media, from the facts and getting the facts right, and if you get them wrong, correcting them. So anyway, I'll end there, except to say, I've learned much more from you than you will learn from me. And, if this is a master class, you're the masters, we're the class.
Also, thank you very much, Donald, for thinking of all kinds of things that I haven't thought of. And also giving us an insight into British journalism, which has a long and proud, So I just wanted to thank Donald for saying all kinds of things I hadn't thought of, and for giving us an insight into long and proud history and robust history of British journalism, which is very real. And I think generally speaking, British journalism does a great job. I will speak from a slightly more detached point of view. I'm a British journalist, but I cover Romania, but I cover other countries as well in our new age, through podcasts, through writing, etc. So I do not see myself rooted in Romania or in Britain, but I do see myself as a journalist. That's what I have been doing for the last 35 years. So the question is journalism doing its job? Now, what is the job of journalism? Because obviously, if this is being asked, there's an issue. So we all know, but it's worth saying, that the job of a journalist is to gather, to investigate, and to disseminate accurate information. We are watchdogs. We are supposed to hold power to account. And more than that, I think we're professional storytellers. That's why journalists call what you non-journalists call it articles. We all in the trade, we call it stories. So why are we asking, is journalism doing its job? It begs the question, maybe it isn't doing its job. And if it isn't doing its job, or there are problems, there must be some challenges. And that's what immediately came to mind. Well, there are a myriad of challenges. When I started out many years ago, 20-odd-year-old freelancer, journalists had great power. We could go and knock on the president's door or send in those days, I don't know, make a telephone call. There weren't emails when I started out. Or we could get an interview with the president. We could get an interview with the prime minister, the foreign minister, somebody in the military. We had great power. We didn't have to be, have a big title, but journalists had great power and people were scared of us and respected us. Now that has totally changed in the last 15, 20 years. And, I'm not an expert on this, but I think it started with Donald Trump. He was the first major world figure to challenge the power of the press. He began to do something that his predecessor, and I know I said this yesterday, Obama would have never done. He actually publicly took on the press and called them the fake media. Before, politicians were scared on what the press could write about them. Now here we have Donald Trump, the leader of the free world, taking on the press, talking about fake media, basically eroding trust in the media. So I think that is one of the first problems, that the challenges that is facing the press is an erosion of trust, and that has started at the highest level from the President of the United States, but it is echoed, I think, particularly by, I don't know if we're going to call them nationalists or radicalists, but certain political parties will challenge journalists, perhaps just online, perhaps physically harass them, threaten them, etc., maybe through the courts. There's something, we've talked about SLAPs, strategic lawsuits against public participation. As the director of Universal, I've just fought 2 SLAPs. Romania doesn't have a law to prevent it. It takes up a lot of time and resources and energy. We actually won them, which is great, but the fact that these are taken against journalists, so that's another challenge that comes generally from society, because these are often not necessarily politicians, but companies. How dare you write this about me? And I would say the lack of respect for journalists, it's not from nationalists or it's all across the board. We always have to send questions in advance. Can you just change this in the article? And there's no reason journalistically why you should change something. I want you to write that this was organized by, but that the journalist no longer has the respect that they used to have. The other obvious challenge facing journalism, which makes it for us hard to do our job, is the business model. It's a failing business model. There are very few successful news organizations. I know the Financial Times is one, because I said to Alec on the way up, so how's the Financial Times doing? Oh, he said it's doing fine. We have these Japanese owners. I said, that's great. It's great to hear about a publication which I respect a lot, that does good journalism, as Donald said, that actually has a successful business model. The New York Times also does, and the reason that they actually do well is, I think, from the cooking section, because a lot of people became subscribers to the New York Times, not so they can read about what's happening in Botswana or some corruption scandal in Romania, but because they're very interested in reading about different dishes and how to prepare it. So that was a very Wordle as well. So that's a successful business model. Washington Post is a very sad story that has gone in complete decline. And this is a story of the press. The challenge is that we have been terribly thinned out. When I moved to Romania in the early 90s, we had the news agencies, we had Reuters, the Associated Press, the France Press, and they all had one foreign correspondent or bureau chief, and then they had 2 or 3 or 4 local journalists and photographers. And then we had freelancers who could actually, people like Alec started their career out here, but there are people like Tim Judah as well, and Chris Stephen, and other people, and Victoria Clark, and Kath Adams. They actually made a living. There is not that money in journalism anymore. There are hardly any there are no international journalists in Romania, to my knowledge, unless perhaps Xinhua, the Chinese news agency, has someone. There are none. And for example, I'm British, and I occasionally do something for foreign outlet, but there's enough work for me to do otherwise than do that. So, and there is no longer the budget. You can't just call up the Telegraph, say, I've got a story, there's a process. Yeah, hi, just file us like 400 words. That doesn't exist anymore. And it's true that there are most, even serious news organizations have bureaus perhaps in, well, I don't know about Moscow now, but they might have a skeleton bureau there, but in places like Paris, Berlin, Rome, Washington, etc., but no longer in Bulgaria, no longer in Romania, no longer in the smaller countries. So that means less coverage. So of course, the problems go down to the internet. The advertising revenue has dried up. For example, we get money from Google Ads, and it depends on the traffic to our site in any month. And we certainly couldn't survive on that. I'm sure there are bigger, organizations, better known sort of TV stations that do make more money. But it's very, very costly, and therefore you do need investors, and that raises all kinds of questions if they interfere, etc., etc. So that sounds pretty grim. It's a toxic mix that journalists are up against. But there is still good journalism going on. In Romania, where I live, investigative journalism has survived and thrived. And that is in part thanks to grants by foreign organizations, by governments, that allow journalists to do important investigative work. The Ratsiu Forum has also allowed a generation of journalists to flourish. We have something called the Ratsiu Report. We have an army of mentees who do very good on-the-ground reporting, the sort that doesn't exist anymore, and produce reports about Romania that cover very important social issues, which you will not see in the international media. And we are now publishing that on Substack. Substack is another example of a good story that's happening because of a difficulty in getting jobs in the media now because of downsizing, because of cuts. A lot of journalists have taken to having their own Substack and have quite sizable followings. Like, for example, Dan has his Ask Questions Later, and there are other journalists too that have very successful Substacks. And because, in fact, of a lack of faith in the media or paywalls that people don't necessarily want to subscribe to, 10 or 20 news organizations, people are going on to Substack. And that is another good, it's sort of a new branch in the tree of journalism, but it is actually something that's quite successful. And I have faith in the young journalists, I think, who've come up. I can see them all, the mentees we work with, they have a lot of energy, they have the spirit that I would call of journalism. So that's very important. And the other thing I would say, and I think Dan said it this morning, what I do think about journalism, it is going through a hard time politically, financially, socially. I mean, for example, in Dubai, the Dubai influence think they're war correspondents, but in fact they're promoting propaganda from the government. And then when the journalists send a team in or journalists in, they're being accused that they're just that they're telling lies. So that is an example of how much the trust in journalism has gone down. But as other people have said today, there is a silent majority that do actually realize, what is the truth and what isn't the truth. And what I do believe, and I'll end now because I've gone on for too long, I believe in the resilience of journalists and of journalism, because our job is to, as they say, we write the first rough draft of history, and you can't write history without storytellers, and we are the professional storytellers.
I think we should address the same question to the people in the room, and would be useful to hear your insights, comments, questions in regards to this topic of whether journalism is doing its job, and also maybe reflect on these 2 days that we've spent together, and where we discussed so many aspects of journalism and the threats to journalism and the relevance of journalism in nowadays. So we are opening the floor to your comments and questions.
Oh, goodness.
Thanks very much. And that was truth versus facts. Are you then saying that you get all the truth, all the facts right. You do a lot of research, you check and check again, and you're aware that what you've assembled are a number of factoids which are right as far as you can possibly be. But something else, something behind that called the truth. And how do the two interact?
On this, on this subject, what I was really trying to say was that I don't think it's always realistic for journalists not to have a view on the subject that they're writing about. And therefore the impartiality much vaunted among individual journalists is fine for certain things. As Cameron said once, you know, if you're covering Congress or the British Parliament or a court case or whatever, then, you know, you're there to report what was said and what was done very straight. If you're, I mean, I suppose, you know, one of my, well, okay, no, I won't say that. I mean, I think it's very difficult in certain social and political situations for a journalist not to have a view or coming to a conclusion about what he's doing. What I was also saying, you know, an example, frankly, is, well, sorry, this springs to my mind, but I mean, if I'm writing about violent settlement in the West Bank, say, as I used to do, have done in the past, it's impossible for me to think, well, you know, there are two sides to this question, and I'm absolutely going to go down the middle on it. What I do think I'm obliged to do is two things: is to get my facts right, and secondly, to talk to the other side, as it were. In other words, to have both points of view reflected in what I write. And actually, I mean, I was going to say, I don't want to knock the Guardian, who are not here to defend themselves, but I mean, one of the things I think the Guardian has a tendency to do was a very, very good piece about people putting flags up, you know, Union Jacks and St. George's flags up in a particular community, actually a particular part of London. And they talked to all sorts of people protesting about this, but they didn't talk to anybody who was actually putting the flags up. And I think that's a sort of, if you like, whether we call it woke or whatever, that's bad. And so I'm not saying, I'm absolutely saying it's important in the West Bank context, it's important to speak to Palestinians, it's important to speak to the settlers. But I don't think that means, provided you've got your facts right and provided you've done that, that you don't in the end come to a conclusion about it. And I think that's what, you know, Cameron was doing. Cameron got sacked along with Tom Hopkinson, who was a sort of very late in life a kind of mentor of mine, from Picture Post, which was a wildly successful picture magazine in the 40s and early 50s, after writing a report about the treatment of North Korean prisoners by the South Koreans during the Korean War. Now, you know, Cameron stuck for the rest of his life to that report, even though it cost him his job at the time, because he thought he'd got it right. And, you know, I think he did get it right, but it did involve him. I mean, it's going back partly to what Dan Perry was saying, is sometimes the truth is political. And in that case it was. But I wasn't trying to, you know, I wasn't trying to sort of, the facts are sacrosanct, no question. I'm just saying that that doesn't necessarily require the individual journalist not to reach a conclusion. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Hi, I'm Mark Canizo. I'm privately here. I have a question which may turn into a mini case study for Alison Donald to lead on, and this has got to do with the relevance of facts. Now, in Germany, as I understand, the press apparently, and this may be out of date, does not mention or deliberately does not report on the national or ethnic origin of an accused assailant, Germany has had a wave of so-called knife attacks, and it's something which is fueling some anti-immigrant hysteria. So the question very practically is, and this is, I think, relevant for everybody here, are you damned if you do mention the ethnic background of the assailant, or are you damned if you don't, and participating in a cover-up? What are the ethical dimensions and the practical dimensions of that?
Well, first of all, I think it's a great question, which is what people always say when they don't quite know how to answer it. I mean, I think that it's difficult to make an absolutely general rule about this. I mean, it is clearly the case, and I'm again being parochial, that in Britain, we had a spate of really serious cases of grooming of young girls. And there was a great deal of hesitation about this. And part of that hesitation was about saying that the people doing the grooming were almost invariably of Pakistani origin. Now, I personally think that was an essential fact. It's tough, and not everybody would agree with me, but I don't think that you could do justice to this story without saying that the guys were, from a particular community in the north of England, and that community was Pakistani, no question. I also think that in cases where, it is clear that a kind of terrorist act is being committed, probably, though not necessarily in connection with some cause or another, I don't really think it makes sense to protect the readers from the fact of the guy's or the woman's, ethnic origin. Where I think it does become a problem is where, is where in every case it's relevant. So, if I don't know, I mean, some crime which is not so connected, like a driving offence or yeah, exactly, or hit and run. I mean, even if it's serious and fatal. And I'm a little bit agnostic about this. I'm not trying to be dogmatic about it. There, I think it's probably less relevant and therefore does carry the risk of inflaming. I mean, we have situations now where, there was an incident on the stabbing that took place on a local train about a few months ago, and everybody on social media, sorry, not everybody, but lots of people on social media would say, obviously a Muslim hate crime. As it happened, the perpetrator was actually black, and the guy that saved some lives was a Muslim who was a worker on the train. And we're living in a climate where speculation and theorization about the ethnic origins of perpetrators of crime are out there in nanoseconds of the crime being committed. And in that context, therefore, I do think we have to be a bit careful. But I've very much got the grooming case in mind, and I think definitely that was part of the picture, and it probably is in a lot of terrorist incidents as well, and therefore needs to be reported.
I agree with what Donald said. The thing is, as a journalist, you're always damned if you do and damned if you don't. One of the most important things as a journalist is actually to develop a thick skin, to have good critical thinking skills, to have perhaps the advice of editors. When I worked at the AP, we would sometimes pore over decision. Do we do a correction on this? Do we do a clarification? Is this fair? And so sometimes over tiny decisions, there would be a lot of thought goes into it. And what journalists try to do, it's like life. There is often no ideal solution. You just have to come to the best and fairest, I think, response to an individual situation. But as I agreed with Donald, but there you are always damned. You'll be damned by one side, you'll be damned by the other. So as a journalist, I think you have to do if you work in an organization, you're lucky to have that sort of hierarchy, then there can be many, heads together coming together to think of the best solution. But you have to do what you think is the best solution for every individual problem. I mean, every day you're like, can you take this story down? Can you report this? Can you report that? We're making decisions all the time. And you just have to hope that you make the right decision about something. And if you don't, you have to take steps to redress it, whether it's a right to reply, whether it's a follow-up story, etc., etc. But sometimes, as I said, because the lack of respect towards the media has fallen so much, we are often bullied. And I do not have a victim mentality, but we are often bullied and intimidated.
Sorry, just very quickly adding to that something I forgot, which is, I mean, if there's a wanted person for a crime and the police are looking for that person, it's pretty crazy not to say what he looks like. So, I mean, that's obviously a case where the ethnic origins of the perpetrator or the wanted person is going to come up. But otherwise, I think we're agreed really about that.
Actually, it's a follow-up question. It came to me as a German. I can tell you that's not the case anymore. There are sometimes it often breaks very quickly. There was something done and was believed from, I don't know, with Turkish heritage, Muslim heritage sometimes. And I think, if I remember correctly, it has something to do also with the pressure from, we have a right-wing party, as you know, rather influential. It's the biggest opposition party. Also for them, accusing media of being biased in a way. And my follow-up question is maybe a rather general one, because we have in public broadcast, we have this discussion, how do you deal with right-wing politicians, interviewing them? We have a party now with, I don't know, 20% or maybe a little bit less in the German Bundestag, so the biggest opposition party. And there is a lot of accusing, okay, if you don't talk to them, you are the proof of being biased in a, I don't know, left-wing progressist way. So how do you deal with it?
Actually, I find that the right-wing politicians obviously often don't want to speak to us, or it's been very difficult to get their telephone numbers. It's a shame Alec Russell isn't here, because he just interviewed George Simeon, who is the head of the Our Party, a radical party. He interviewed him, so that was quite important. But I think that's because the Financial Times had covered George Simeon during the election from their Budapest correspondent, so there was a sort of avenue. But generally, the right-wing parties are very suspicious of journalists that don't openly promote them, because obviously we have a lot of, now it's something I don't think I really mentioned, you have a lot of people who want to be journalists, or sort of fake journalists, if you like, sort of social influencers who set themselves up and they will have a very definite political stance. Often they side with the radicalists or the nationalists, and those are the people. We have one in Romania, Anca Alexandrescu, I'm talking, who has a big show on Realitate TV, and it's an open door for George Simeon, for Călin Georgescu, all these right-wing figures out of the mainstream party. But other than that, for what I would say mainstream journalists like I am, we are sort of treated with suspicion. So we do cover them. I try to cover them respectfully. I don't use epithets. I don't use insulting words, etc., etc. But I personally I find it hard to get access because of a lack of trust. The society now is so polarized that both sides don't trust each other and they don't talk to each other. That's why it's so important that someone like Alec did manage to get an interview with the two leaders of Our. Because they look at you and we don't trust you, you're a globalist, or whatever. And what do you mean? It's there, and everybody is given a label. So we do cover them, and I try and personally, I don't generally write editorials. I try to be respectful in my coverage of them and accurate. But also editorial selection shows a bias, if you like, what stories you choose to cover and what you don't. Let's go back to immigration. There were a couple of attacks on immigrants in Romania last summer, which we covered, and they were quite ugly attacks. Okay, nobody died, but they were, you know, spitting in their faces and yelling at them, etc., which we covered. And then this winter in Romania, we had a particularly nasty winter, and there was a lot of ice and snow, which we haven't had for many years. And there's a town in southern Romania called Craiova, and a young girl, like 5 years old, had gone out onto the ice, and she slipped in. And an immigrant went, and who was in Craiova, who lived in Romania, and saved her. And the local mayor said they would make him a citizen of honor. And I thought, and I, as a journalist, I did make an editorial decision. This is a good, positive story. And I think in the climate where we live, where there's so much polarization, it's my responsibility as a journalist to present a real, live, true case in which shows you that immigrants aren't as the right wing portrays them. So I remember I wrote this story, and, you know, like, this is a good whatever. And then I posted it on X. And I remember there were so many angry messages to me, like, you didn't cover the rape, you didn't. There's also a lot of disinformation about, you know, there was a case like this person was raped, and it's all, some of the information is very unclear. So what I remember about is the fact that I had a positive and true story about an immigrant, but that I was being attacked on X, not on Facebook, saying that these people hated a positive story about a migrant. So yes, the truth is political. You're right, the truth is political, but there's nothing we can do about it. It's a true story. And I thought it was my responsibility as a journalist, as a, you know, responsible citizen, to cover this kind of story. And also it's a feel-good story, and people do like feel-good stories as well.
I mean, I was sort of hoping to dodge this question, but I mean, actually, I think you, in principle, have to interview everybody. I mean, in other words, you know, the FD are a very important political party, much as one may absolutely loathe them. And so increasingly is Reform. Reform in Britain is leading in the polls now. It would be crazy to not interview them. I mean, I don't think that means that your job is to give them a platform. Actually, Farage, the leader of the Reform Party, is brilliant at dealing with the press. I mean, he's actually quite easy to interview. He gets a lot of mileage, and maybe a little too much mileage, but that's not a reason for not interviewing him. I must admit, I blanch a bit at the thought of Tommy Robinson, who's a sort of much more extreme version of Farage. But I mean, you know, I don't think it's our job as journalists to kind of decide who should or shouldn't be interviewed. And, you know, the journalists can work out with what sort of levels. I mean, I think respect, as Alison says, is absolutely important. That doesn't mean that you can't ask tough questions as well. But yeah, I don't think it's very easy to exclude people on the grounds of their political views.
But don't you think that some of these right-wing characters we're talking about don't actually want to be interviewed by the mainstream media?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably is true. And of course, again, I'm being very parochial. I think that I think what you say is absolutely right, and it's certainly strikingly the case in Israel, for example, where very right-wing politicians who were previously very willing to put themselves about in the mass media. I can't remember, somebody made a really, really good point about this in another session, which is that social media now means that they can communicate directly with their bases and with other people. So they really don't need to be interviewed. And I think that's true. I think it's less true in Britain, where I think as I say, Reform Party has quite a sophisticated attitude to the media, and in their case probably are quite willing to be. So I mean, I think it varies from country to country and situation to situation.
Just one, I would like to add something. In the Romanian case, and Alison is very much aware of this situation, during the presidential elections last year, one of the candidates was the leader of the far-right party, AUR, and he, at some point, one of the big media televisions attempted to organize a debate between the candidates, and they were visiting his office to try and convince him to do this. and he surreptitiously filmed the producers. There were about 5 producers and journalists from the station. He was sitting at his big desk, and he had these journalists aligned in front of him. He filmed them, and he broadcast. He put it on social media, and he was talking very dismissive to them. So basically, he used this as a communication opportunity, and also as an opportunity to trash journalism, Romanian journalism in general. And it was not the only instance in which he attacked journalists, but this was like a really worrying situation.
Politicians, they've gone on the attack. Yeah, I mean, Alex, they film us now, and there is the journalist really has to. A journalist now really has to stand their ground. And I'm not talking about just basic things about what elements you put in your story. They're like, you must put this in. Why do I have to put this in? Because that's the contractual agreement. I say, well, I'm not PR, I'm a journalist. But you do have to stand your ground. And people wouldn't have behaved like this 20 years ago, 15 years ago, even 10 years ago.
So, thank you for this great discussion. I have 2 questions. We are talking about, well, we want to avoid manipulation by media, but I think we should think another time again about media being manipulated, because this kind of attention economics, which is especially applied by right-wing parties, we are suffering from it. As a German, you remember, Markus, there was this discussion of one right-wing politician. He said, "Oh, this 13 years of fascist period in Germany, it's just a flea shit in the long history of Germany." And the media discussed about this for 2-3 days, and there was no other topic. And it was a non-topic. It was just one idiot flooding the room with flea shit in this time. And so I think there should be more reflection about which topics do we deal with, and do we need some more discussion about this? First point. Second is how do you see the future of funding of a free press? Because we need quality journalism, not Germanism, Germanism too, but journalism, journalism. And I see that there is a decrease in people willing to pay for good media, because it's cheap to get, and even harder by AI, which is filtering everything. We have discussed about this. So thanks. 2 points.
I totally agree that journalists get carried away with a topic. And journalists, actually, I hate to say this, we're great copycats. We see what everybody else is doing. We follow the same story. So we had a similar story in Romania. It was about the former president's plane and how much it had cost him. Now, it was a story, but it was absolutely flogged to death every day, all day long. And what that meant is that other important topics were actually being ignored or pushed to one side. I'm not saying it wasn't a story. It was the obsessive coverage, which sounds a little bit what you're saying. You're not saying it's not a story, but going on and on and on and on, and then to the detriment of not covering other stories. And as I said, unfortunately, journalists often cover, if they say one outlet is doing that, they'll do it, etc., etc. So journalists actually often do copy each other. But again, that should be an internal discussion. I think in newsrooms, you can't really impose what journalists cover in the end. That's the reality. Now, going back to your second question, which is a question as a director of a small news site, and, obviously very aware of the financial pressure that journalists are under, or news organizations are under, because it is basically a failing business model. My views are France actually has quite a good system. They have a ministry where I think that every single media organization, and I don't know the absolute details, is eligible for funding depending on their audience, whether they're left-wing, right-wing, etc., etc. And the way that the money is allocated is not based on Sarkozy's in power, Mitterrand's or whoever's in power. It's not based on the political colour of the government. It's based on sort of what the audience is of every organisation, because it's not an ideal situation, but the France sees the existence of a media as an absolute necessity, as part of democracy and part of civilization. And I remember when we were first starting out, I was at the AP, and we like snootily looked at the AFP. They get money from the government. Well, sorry, 30 years later, I can see that while it's not ideal, having some funding from the government done in a non-political way based on traffic is a good idea. The other solution, I think, is I think the media needs not necessarily media owners, but strategic investors in the media. People who invest in media because it is part of our democracy and part of our civilization. But that would work on perhaps an individual basis. We don't want owners. No media wants an owner poking their nose in all the time, telling you what to write, etc., etc. From the get-go, you have to have a relationship of respect and basically of non-interference. So I do think we have come to the time where such a thing as like there is money in the world. There are all these hedge funds. There are people who are very, very rich in our world. And investing in the media and quality media does uphold democratic values and does uphold civilization. So I think that's a discussion that needs to be had. I'm much too small of a person to lead it, but I this is something I have been thinking about for about a year.
Short question to the French model. Doesn't it reward clickbaiting?
I don't know all the details, but I know it's been going on for many, many years. So I think it's, unfortunately, I don't have any of my French colleagues here, but it's been going on for many, many years before the internet. So I think it's an established system. And I used to, look in a sort of superior way to my French colleagues. But now I see that it is perhaps a workable model. There is some, obviously they also get money from advertising, etc., but it is a way for French society to say that media is important.
I was hoping to hear also from the younger journalists in the room, because I think maybe your perspective is very much different. I don't know if you feel that journalism is changing, or we are not us, the elder ones, let's say, we don't see journalism the same way you do, maybe. We scared the young ones. I will ask maybe a controversial question, because I like controversies. How should we approach this idea of having a journalism that is also activist? Sometimes, in some cases, we know there are journalists who are openly activist in their work. And there are even sometimes formalized ways of doing this type of activism. There is at least one news organization that I know has a partnership with an anti-corruption NGO, where basically the idea is that after the journalists write, the anti-corruption NGO can take that output and use it in their anti-corruption work. So it's a formalized relationship, partnership. And I wonder, how do you and also the people in the room, and again, I'm turning to the younger journalists, how do you see this idea? And of course, this is only one of the models, because now journalism is changing. We know that there are initiatives in journalism where using the output of journalistic work for fundraising in strange ways, like for investing in the media market, starts to be seen as an option. And okay, for me, it's difficult to digest these ideas, so that's why I'm asking the question to you all.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think it's a very interesting subject to open because I work for InfoSudest, a small investigative outlet in Constanza, and I think in this regard we have a bit more experience with this what we call a little blend of journalism and activism, in the sense that InfoSudest for the past over 10 years has been writing about the historical legacy of our city and the county Constanza, and about the importance of certain historical buildings that have been basically abandoned in the city. Now, as part of what we have been doing, besides journalistic investigations and articles about something like the Royal Palace built by Queen Maria in Constanza, if you guys have heard of it, we also did activism in the sense that we had an active campaign to promote this building, the Royal Palace of Queen Maria, which was illegally sold 20 years ago by the most corrupt mayor in the history of Constanza, Mazare. We are the ones who investigated that sale and discovered that it was illegal. And as a result of our investigation, about 3 years ago in 2022, the Royal Palace went back into the state's property. The contract was basically nulled and the building became public property once again. Before that, the problem is that the investigation my colleagues wrote, was like 13 years ago. So it took the state about 13 years from the moment it discovered this illegality to the point to return the building back to the public property. And in this time, my colleagues and I a little bit we campaigned for this. I mean, we had awareness campaigns about this exact situation. One of them we even took all the way to the Romanian parliament for several weeks. We had an exhibition there. So my point is, I believe there is healthy ways for journalists to also combine their work with activism, as long as, of course, I also believe that it is important to follow some very important rules, like the fact that such campaigns should be politically non-partisan. In my opinion, we never associated our campaign for the palace with any kind of political party or candidate or personality or whatever. We were talking specifically only about our work and why it's important and the value of the palace and so on and on. It was entirely non-partisan, essentially non-political. Even though we were trying to get the government's attention to this issue, we didn't collaborate directly with anybody in the government for that, for example. So I think that's a healthy way to do activism as a journalism. But I believe the most important part for it is to remain non-political and non-partisan. I think that's the one and big true rule that should be followed in all situations. As for collaborating with NGOs and raising money for certain things, we don't have experience with this yet, so I'm honestly not sure. I'm actually curious to hear more about that as well, like what everybody else is thinking. But I think this is the baseline.
Yeah, let's have.
Thank you, Gabi. I actually forgot about this type of campaigning that you're doing. I had something else in mind. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think activism and journalism should be separate, and quite strictly so. But that doesn't mean they can't be using in order to create change or any sort of that thing. I think the main issue here is with impact. So how much impact does journalistic work, and how much should the journalist be in charge of making that impact happen? And I think there's a tricky line in which journalists end up taking on the work of people who actually have power, of institutions who actually have power, or advocacy networks or NGOs who should be their job to take on the reporting and then do it further. But that's to say that I see a lot of media outlets and journalism initiatives who've developed impact teams, and not so they take the research that journalists do, and I think this is where a lot of the work should be done in disseminating the information and not letting it die on a website. So how can you package it differently, and how can you reach out as a journalist to institutions, to NGOs, and say, this is what we found. We're open to have a discussion and share more. And then from then on, it's the advocacy or the government or the institutions to take on and basically do something about it. But I think there's a tricky, like a slippery slope of putting too much pressure or responsibility on journalists to make sure that their work has impact when it's not there. They don't have the power to actually create the impact and like change the things that need to be changed. What they can do is communicate it better and obviously be more open to discussion and don't let the stories die.
Thank you, Andrei. Loredana? And Donald, you go ahead after.
Yeah, the subject, the topic is very actual for Romania, and especially, I'm sorry, not that in other countries not also actual. But here I've seen journalists, well-known journalists, asking, for example, to the Romanians to go out to the protest for justice because it's now or never, or to vote for pro-Europeans. Is this activism? Is not activism? Of course, journalism should not be political. We shouldn't take a stance. Nevertheless, we have a social responsibility. We are not only journalists, we are citizens of a certain country. And how do you maintain the good balance? For example, you cannot no longer, in my opinion, make journalism, at least not in Romania, in the manner she said, he said. We have, for example, I'll give you an example, a Social Democrat Party who is now posing in a hero, in a savior of the poor, because they made some amendments to the law of the budget to help the retired people. If you say the Socialist Democrat Party did this, but you do not say that the Socialist Democrat Party throw up the budget, raise it up to the sky through the measures they took previously, you are lying through omissions because you mislead the people. They will think Social Democrat Party it's a hero. So it's a truth become political. It's not that you take a stance. It's not that you are I don't know working for a political party or trying to promote a certain political party, but saying the truth. It's a must, and it's a matter of social responsibilities. And another issue about interviewing politicians from I don't know for example, Alison Matler mentioned our. It's also becoming an act of courage in Romania, and you also have to take not necessarily a stance, but to put some questions because would turn into an enemy into their eyes. Otherwise, you become their platform for spreading venom through the ears of the people. So you need to put the correct questions, which are transforming you in a target. I'll give you an example. After the elections were cancelled, George Simion had an not press conference, but she was out to vote. Of course, sections were closed, no elections were held. And I was asking, it was all the press around, a lot of reporters. I was asking questions about the support he's giving to Călin Georgescu. What do you think about his connections to Russia? Questions he didn't like. And in that press conference, he told my name, my complete name, Mrs. Loredana Diacu. Why are you asking about Russia? So 3 times. I didn't understand why is he doing this. But when I went back to the headquarters and I opened my laptop, I understood why. He put a bullseye on my chest because I had hundreds, thousands of messages, of threats, of insults, and I didn't block my account, but I had to erase a lot. And shortly, truth is political.
About that incident, which sounds absolutely horrendous, what's your own conclusion from it? Is it that you shouldn't have, that it would have been better if you hadn't gone to ask him the questions?
No, I would do exactly the same, and I will do it exactly the same the next time. And I was doing the same the next time, so yes. Because it was the last occasion when I met George Simion on the field.
Yes, no. Here we got another. Well, no, I was only going to say very, very briefly that of course I wanted to qualify. I mean, if I didn't sufficiently qualify my thing about you should talk to everybody, of course you should be putting the tough questions to them and everybody. For example, I still don't think that we, even in Britain, cover enough the political funding question. I mean, we do cover it, but I mean, why parties take a certain position when they're funded by a certain person. So, and so I'm not remotely saying that you should be, giving extreme parties a platform, but I think asking the tough questions is the right way to go. And sorry, I was going to say very quickly, to take this example from Constanza. I mean, I'm not saying I'm troubled by the NGO thing, and I'm, best agnostic and also a bit uncomfortable about it. But I mean, the kind of campaign that we're talking about happened in Constanza, the mainstream legacy media, or whatever one calls it, have been campaigning for years, decades. I mean, sometimes on really good issues, sometimes on not such good issues. Even the Daily Mail, campaigned over a murder of a black man in Peckham. Yeah, Stephen Lawrence. So, yeah. I mean, there's nothing, it seems to me, new or completely outre about campaigning within the sort of constraints that you talked about. That was all I was going to say.
Going back to the right-wing thing, I think that we do have to report what they said, because on the one hand, you say we're promoting their platform, but on the other hand, we are confirming to the people that don't like them what they're saying. So people have the right to choose. Those that believe will believe it, and the other side will realise how, in their minds, how horrific what they say is. Whereas if we don't report it, maybe our or whatever is actually quite a nice mainstream party after all. So I think we do have to put out their messages. But I know it's very difficult. I myself interviewed Diana Shoshwaka, and it was quite a surreal experience. I did it for down in Radio Free for Radio Free Europe. It was and I was on her territory as well, so it was quite surreal. But it was in the end, it was quite respectful on both sides.
So she didn't lock you as she did with the right journalist.
We were at a church under a bell, and then all her supporters were around her. And even when I asked, I have to be fair, when I asked her about whether she considered herself anti-Semitic, all her supporters who were listening to everything I was speaking Romanian were actually quite respectful of me. Nobody started heckling me or anything. So that was a lesson also for me that people aren't always the way you might think they might be. So that's one thing. And going back to the idea of advocacy journalism, what Donna said is completely right about the British press, but I have a different background. I come from the newswires, and we're very sort of absolutist, if you like. I remember once we had a stringer down in Timișoara, and there was a lot of attacks on the press. I think it's about 2004. And Dragos, our stringer, he wanted to, send us a report, which is fine, but he also wanted to take part in the protest. And the editorial decision for Office in Vienna is you either take part in the protest or you write the story. You can't do both. So as a bit of a purist on this, my view is the only thing I would be comfortable about openly being activist for would be defending journalist rights, because defending journalist rights or defending press freedom, not freedom of speech because that's been politicized, weaponized, is something that enables me to do my job. Anything other than that, I would feel I wouldn't consider it my job. That said, it doesn't mean that journalists don't have editorial lines. For example, we cover a lot. Anytime there's I get something from the LGBT community, I will, reproduce that. We'll cover that. I'll make a deliberate editorial decision that we will cover these minorities, particularly in Romania, where there is a lot of restriction on rights for LGBT people. That doesn't mean I'm an activist for them. I would never go on one of their marches as a private person. I don't think I would go on any march. Even it is hard because as a journalist, I remember when there was all these justice protests in 2017-18, and my heart, I thought it was great. But you have to remember you're a journalist, and sometimes you have to kind of stop being too enthusiastic when you have a vox pop and you agree with someone. So it is hard. I mean, you do as a journalist, you agree with some things, but for the sake of the profession, I think it's best to keep a clear dividing line. But that said, I understand that Romanian journalism do get involved in activism. But I think perhaps, as you said, as long as it's clearly delimited that that we are doing this activism for this, not then it's a little bit more acceptable. But I personally wouldn't.
That is truth. For example, activism. If I am publishing a declaration of George Simion who says something, And afterwards, I consider it is my duty, if it's something who's harming the people, who's disinformation, because to come and explain afterwards. He says this, but this is making Russian agenda. He said the Romanian state is giving money to Ukrainian child, but this is not true. Yeah. And
Context.
I don't
You always
consider
put
this as activism. I consider this as a social responsibility,
yeah,
journalistic responsibility.
context.
Codruța, and I think we should wrap it up and take a 10 minutes break, John, and after that we do the. Or yeah, if do you, yeah, if you still have the power, but no, Codruța first. No, first Codruța needs to you. After that, I was just planning ahead. Sorry.
I was planning to ask a question, but I just want to tell you I know exactly what you're talking about because he was also targeting the fact checkers at Factual, and he said it repeatedly, and we also got loads of messages and stuff like that. But my curiosity is, so let's say maybe there's someone worse than George Simeon. Are we still journalists if we say don't vote for that guy? I can go extreme, like don't vote for Hitler or something like that.
Like the Washington Post until this year, you can have an editorial, and I'm sure the Financial Times, we have decided we're coming down on the side of this person or this person, or in this case, don't. But it should be. I think it should be not every week. It should be perhaps before an election, and it is the editorial position of your news outlet. I think that's acceptable journalistically.
Sorry, but I started my career in journalism in 1989. Sorry for those who don't know what is that. At that moment, Soviet Union was falling down, and we had protests in the center of the city every single day against Soviet Union and against all the abuses and for our freedoms. And I was working as a journalist in the morning, doing fastly my job, and then I was in the protest every single day. I love the way of protesting and getting out our freedoms. I've met my husband there. We protested together. We got married, and we had children, and our children grew up at those protests. Next protest, let's say. So I had an attitude against Soviet Union, Russian army, corruption in many ways. And if you come to Chisinau suddenly in different days, you may find myself in front of the Russian embassy protesting again. Or in the center of the city if there are protests against big phenomena. I never allowed myself to say don't vote for a name, but I always allowed myself saying don't vote for corrupt, and we published the list of articles and investigative stories where corrupt names appear. And we had a referendum for the EU. It was considered a kind of a political thing, but we openly as a newsroom said, we promote EU because we promote democracy and we consider this is the best standards of democracy, and we are against what Russia is doing. And so it's kind of activism, but we are doing journalism too, and just wanted to give you to know at the end of the day what we are doing. Thank you.
Just to let you know, in Romania, actually, theoretically, it's not possible anymore to say vote for a certain candidate, even if you are a media outlet. We had, during the last elections, we had the social media posts taken down by the Central Electoral Bureau, because some of our colleagues in kind of media, Politică la Minut, they posted some posters saying vote for the Democratic candidate against George Simion. And the Electoral Bureau decided to put them down because they were considered political advertising that was not marked. This connects to my earlier speech, so yeah. So no stress. They didn't go for big media, of course, because they were afraid of the big media. They went for the little ones. So I think we could stop now and invite John and Mihai Mark and Marcus Teglas to